So, Sonnet on the Sea is the last of the Keats poems that is in the Romantics collection for Edexcel. I think I'd actually argue it's my favourite in terms of analysing, and the way that I see it, and I think the thing that makes it interesting, and it probably will be no surprise after what I've said in the earlier videos, is this idea that on his gravestone, Keats asked to be inscribed, "Here lies one whose name is writ in water." And traditionally that's seen as Keats's comment on the fact that essentially he could never shake off that Cockney school label that, he's very hurt when Wordsworth didn't appreciate his poetry. But it's that wider point that people argue that Keats is essentially saying life is transient and my poetry similarly will be forgotten. So, trying to remember me is like writing my name in water. It will just instantly be covered up again. I think through the journey over the last three poems, I think you do see Keats starting to get to a point where he accepts transience and he sees it very differently. Particularly in Ode on Melancholy, it's almost like he's, like I say, having a word with himself and trying to change how he sees things. And I think Sonnet on the Sea is the kind of logical endpoint of that. So obviously it's about the sea, and I think it's about a large body of water, and I tend to see it as Keats essentially learning to be okay with transience, and I think that's what this poem is. It's a classic sonnet in the sense that you've got the 14 lines, you've got the iambic pentameter all the way through, you've got the rhyme scheme that is common of sonnets. Again, quite an irregular rhyme scheme that Keats seemed to like, where we don't have the AB rhymes of Byron, for example. What we have is lines rhyming with lines that have maybe come 4 or 5 lines before them. You've also got the clear change in tone, so the clear sort of alter between the first 8 lines and the last 6 lines, which again is classic of a sonnet. So Keats is using this form that was used by Petrarch, used by Shakespeare. He's going back to an earlier time, pre the Industrial Revolution, which is exactly what the other Romantics have done. But not in a sense of arguing, simply for the language of common man that Wordsworth does. Not simply about arguing for pantheism, which Wordsworth and Coleridge did, but actually as a way of, I think, Keats being okay with the fact that he is part of this history. He's a second generation, and other generations will come, and it's okay that he's made his contribution, and then will go and perhaps will be forgotten. So there's a real self-awareness here, I think, of where Keats fits as a romantic. So he's talking about the sea. It keeps eternal whisperings around desolate shores, and with its mighty swell gluts twice 10,000 caverns. Okay, so he's talking about the sea here. So while the shores are desolate, the sea is gently whispering in the background. Okay, in Ode on a Grecian Urn, he talks about the sort of desolate places where the life that was shown on the urn would have been. Now he's seeing this slightly differently. Yes, those shores might be desolate, but the sea is eternal. The sea carries on, like the nightingale, like the urn. The sea is something that carries on, but it's whispering. It's not like the urn in the sense that it's still and silent. The sea itself is constantly whispering. And with this mighty swell gluts twice 10,000 caverns. Okay, so the sea is this mighty thing, and yes, there are gaps left. There are these caverns, which I think throughout the poem Keats perhaps sees as this sign of transience, of loss, of death. But that's what the sea does. And then the next bit, till the spell of Hecate leaves them their old shadowy sound. So again, uses this kind of classical imagery, but making the point that essentially these caverns are full of the shadows of sounds, in the way that the urn had the shadows of life on it. The caverns are just the kind of the shadows of the sea. And I guess Keats is sort of saying, you can focus on the shadows, focus on the cave, focus on what's not there that should be, or you can remember that the sea will come back again. Often 'tis in such gentle temper found, that scarcely will the very smallest shell be moved for days from whence it sometimes fell. So of course the sea is not always this big mighty thing that's swelling. It can also be very, very sort of gentle and peaceful. Talks about the small shell that's barely moved, almost like the opposite of Ode to the West Wind. Shelley sees the west wind as this big thing that's going to create this wider movement, and Keats seems to be arguing, well, no, these wider forces aren't quite like that. I guess it's a bit like Tiger. The tiger is both beautiful and terrifying, and I guess Keats is sort of saying the sea is the same thing. That's the nature of God. That's the nature of these eternal things. When last the winds of heaven were unbound. Okay, so the sea, you know, moves in this sort of pattern, in this cycle, that the winds of heaven can be unbound at any time, but can also be, you know, be sort of left, and the sea can be very sort of gentle. Like with Ode on Melancholy, we get the sense that this is according to a higher wish, you know, whether that be heavens or just eternity, or Mother Nature, or whatever you want to call it. That this isn't a man-made thing, you know. Keats, like the other romantics, showing essentially the weakness of man compared to these bigger things, the weakness of the Age of Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution compared to these much bigger forces. There's a bit of a Volta here, there's a bit of a change of tone then for the last 6 lines. O ye, okay, so he's speaking directly here, I guess to himself, but to mankind generally, to other poets, perhaps to the next generation of romantics. That exclamative showing him addressing them directly. Who have your eyeballs vexed and tired, feast them upon the wideness of the sea. Like Wordsworth says, you know, I feed off nature in my kind of more tricky times amidst a din of cities. Keats is saying, you know, acknowledge the sea. Use that, don't focus on the vexed and tired nature of the eyes, focus on the wideness of the sea. And it's like in Ode on Melancholy, Keats says, you know, don't focus on what you've not got, focus on what you could have again, focus on the fact that life is transient, and it has to be transient, and it has to keep moving on. I see it's a great image of that, because it's eternal, and yet it is also transient, isn't it? It comes and it goes. O ye, he repeats that again, whose ears are dinned with uproar, rude, or fed too much with cloying melody. I love those 2 lines in the sense that Wordsworth talks about the din of cities, but Keats himself has had this kind of cloying melody that we get in Ode to a Nightingale and Ode on a Grecian Urn, the pipes and the Nightingale's song. So in those 2 lines, I think Keats really sort of places himself in the same way that Wordsworth got rest and got pleasure amidst the din of cities from nature and from pantheism. Keats can also gain some respite from his tendency for this cloying melody, this slightly woozy, slightly drunken, slightly laconic style of poetry. So I really like the way that he puts the 2 of them together there. You know, I do see Keats sort of as a second generation Wordsworth, and he puts them there. Both of them almost can be helped by the sea. Keats can find his answer in the sea, in the same way as Wordsworth finds his answer not just in the sea, I guess, but in nature as a whole. He's been fed too much with cloying melody. When To Autumn was on the spec as well, it was great, because To Autumn is all about, you know, the boughs of the trees are hanging down. There's too many apples there. They need to sort of fall off, and that idea of fed too much is really seen in To Autumn. You know, you can have too much of a good thing here. And the last 2 lines: sit ye near some old cavern's mouth, and brood until ye start as if the sea nymphs quiet. And I love that enjambment there. You know, you don't want to say about enjambment it makes it flow. You want to find particular examples. So Keats says, you know, yes, sit by the cave. You know, I guess that's a wider metaphor. Focus on what's gone. Focus on how life is transient in the way that you have on Ode on a Nightingale and Ode to a Grecian Urn. And yes, and brood, but then the enjambment, brood until ye start. Only brood until you actually start again, in the same way that the sea comes and it goes, as if the sea nymph's quiet. So it ends on this really positive, really kind of noisy image that is very out of kilter, really, with Keats' sort of lazy tone throughout. Look at those exclamatives that you get in those final 6 lines. It's Keats giving himself, I guess, a bit of a call to arms and saying, yeah, you know, it's okay to brood on what's gone. It's okay to brood on the transience of life, but you have to accept that it is that way, and it is okay. And that's why I see the inscription on Keats' gravestone, "Here lies one as whose name is written in water," as being Keats' sort of final acceptance that like the sea, his poetry may well sort of come and go, but that's okay. It's better to be like that than to be dead like the urn. You know, Keats ultimately, I think, embraces the sea as the image of how to live. You know, you accept the transient, you accept the change. By doing so, you almost become part of a wider poetic tradition. You know, ironically, by the end of this poem, he's closer allied to Wordsworth than perhaps he ever has been before. And I think that's kind of Keats' answer, which is why I see the gravestone potentially as quite a positive thing.